Welcome to the panel titled The Summit for Democracy, an Important Step or an Empty Symbol. I'm Sarang Shidore, and we are at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft are hosting this panel. And the Quincy Institute is a foreign policy think tank based in Washington that promotes a grand strategy of restraint. We oppose US primacy and support strongly enhanced diplomacy for achieving national security. In today's panel, we're going to talk about the Summit for Democracy that's coming up and that's organized by the Biden administration. It's going to happen this week, at the end of the week. And it has triggered a very lively debate between its supporters and critics. Those supporters say that the event is an important step forward for promoting democracy and American values, and also makes America safer in the process. Critics point to the many inconsistencies in US foreign policy when it comes to democracy and generally dismiss the significance of the event. So to discuss this very important topic, we have three excellent experts today on our panel. Marlène Laruelle is a French historian, sociologist, and political scientist specializing on Eurasia and Europe. She's research professor and director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University, and also runs its liberal governance program, and also conducts research in that space, among other things. Daniel Nexon is a professor at the School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown University. His most recent book, co-authored with Alexander Cooley, is Exit from Hegemony: The Unraveling of the American Global Order. He blogs at Lawyers, Guns, and Money and the Duck of Minerva, and has written extensively on the topic of the liberal international order. Anatole Lieven is a senior research fellow right here at the Quincy Institute. He formerly worked as a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, where he taught comparative politics at think tanks in Washington, DC, and as a British journalist in South Asia and the former Soviet Union. His most recent book, Climate Change and the Nation State, appeared this year in an updated paperback edition. And he also recently wrote a piece on the Democracy Summit for the Quincy Institute publication, which I recommend all of you read daily, Responsible Statecraft. So we are actually going to dive right in, and I'm going to start with Anatole Lieven himself. And I'm going to ask you, Anatole, about your piece, because it just came out in Responsible Statecraft. It was a critical piece on the Summit for Democracy. And in the piece, among other things, you faulted the Summit for Democracy on one particular charge, which is hypocrisy. So just staying on that point for a moment, explain what you meant by this charge of hypocrisy.
Thank you, Sarang. Well, I fear that the summit will in fact draw attention to an alas very obvious fact that in many parts of the world, the United States supports authoritarian regimes and, of course, also highly illiberal democracies, and that this is not coincidental. In fact, US primacy in the Middle East and elsewhere rests on these authoritarian allies or client states, I'm afraid in very much the same way that Russia's geopolitical position in various parts of the world rests on authoritarian states like Belarus or Syria. And so, I taught for 7 years in the Middle East at, as you said, Georgetown University in Qatar. And I have to say that none of my students from the Middle East or from South Asia, even the ones who were very anxious to have the United States as an ally of their countries, but none of them believed that the United States is committed to spreading democracy and freedom, because there was, in fact, nothing in the history of their own countries or regions which would give them any reason to believe that. And I think here there is an important difference from the Cold War, because clearly this is a very Cold War project. It's an attempt to recreate the idea of the free world, as in the Cold War, with America as its leader. But the thing is that the key ideological and political battlefield, not military battlefield, thank God, of the Cold War was Europe. And in Europe, there really was a clear-cut division. I mean, with ambiguities like Turkey and Greece, but still, between Western liberal democracy and communist totalitarianism or authoritarianism, with the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain as obvious dividing lines. So there, the United States really could be claiming, if not to lead the free world, to lead free Europe. But of course, during the Cold War, all over the rest of the world, the US was supporting authoritarian regimes as long as they were anti-communist. Well, in the struggle with China, which this is mostly about, Russia as well, of course, the key battlefield there is Asia. And in Asia, just as during the Cold War, everything is so much more blurred. Blurred not just in terms of United States support for authoritarian regimes, as in the Middle East, but also for highly and increasingly illiberal elected regimes, as in India and the Philippines. So that I'm afraid, A, there is the charge of hypocrisy, but B, this is based on a Cold War model, which does not actually work in these new circumstances.
Right. I'm going to take this discussion to Dan Nixon now, and I'm going to ask you, Dan, to respond to the point Anatol has made, which I think is, there's quite a bit there, isn't there? So in addition to the countries he's mentioned, there's also others, countries like Brazil, with Jair Bolsonaro, Poland, Andrzej Duda. You have also a country like Congo, which is invited, Iraq, and then Pakistan, which is way down on the list of of democracies, if it can be called even that. So on the other hand, countries like Turkey, which are in many ways, say, better than Pakistan on the democratic record, at least at this point, are not there, nor is Hungary. So there is a real, this is not just about one or two exceptions, but quite a long list of what appear to be exceptions, but then end up becoming the rule, perhaps. So is the extreme inconsistency essentially a sign that this summit is a PR stunt and not meaningful at all? Does it severely and fatally damage the message that this summit is claiming to try and send?
Well, thank you for having me. I'll just start by saying that I'm not a huge fan of this summit or even the concept of a summit of democracies. So I'm an odd duck to be in the position of, I guess, the defender of the kind of project. And I agree with a lot of the criticisms that Anatol makes and that others have made. I will say that I think we need to be a little bit careful about some overly stark binary choices. For example, symbolic politics, symbolism is not empty, symbolic politics are important. And both the criticisms and defenses of the summit presuppose that symbols matter. The second is that hypocrisy is not the most horrific thing in the world. Hypocrisy, as we know from a lot of social science, is the way that organizations, states, other actors reconcile the inevitable conflict between norms and between different kinds of norms, say norms in favor of democracy, or norms about defending security, or norms about break power competition, and that we would rather have a world with hypocritical liberal powers than liberal powers that are hypocritical at all, that just don't care about liberalism in any way, shape, or form. So hypocrisy actually helps to sustain norms, even under conditions like international politics, when norms are fragile and often violated. So I kind of think that it's, we have to be a little bit careful here. We don't want to overstate the significance. In a sense, a lot of what we see with the Summit of Democracies is business as usual, an attempt to elevate a certain type of concern. Will it muddy the waters? Probably. Is it going to be catastrophic for anybody involved? Almost certainly not. But the reason I think it muddies the waters is I think that there's a fundamental confusion here about what kinds of analogies are useful and what kinds of analogies should be thinking about at all if they are useful. So it's very easy to look at something like the Summit for Democracies, and because of the way in which the composition of the states would seem in many ways to reflect a kind of mix of anti-China geopolitical agenda on the one hand, and then an effort to punish very specific illiberal democracies or countries that have engaged in democratic backsliding, or perhaps rewarding those who haven't backslid as far, or whom the United States government sees as potential places where you might improve the position of democracy. And because there's that weird kind of mix of imperatives, it definitely makes things confused. But I don't fundamentally think that the idea behind the Sum of Democracies should be understood as a Cold War analogy. I don't think we're talking about an effort to divide the world into a Chinese bloc and a U.S. bloc, or between between a kind of a West and an autocratic bloc. When we think about the potential, the sort of current crisis of democracies, I think we're thinking about a period that is more like that of the late 20s. In which the problem is that within democracies themselves, we have forces of illiberalism, forces of autocracy, forces of erosion, and we don't have a binary between two competing ideologies. We have a number of different competing liberal and illiberal ideologies in the world. We have reactionary populism, aligned often with a kind of cultural traditionalism of the type espoused by Russia. We have an authoritarian capitalist model from China, which is quite distinctive, and which influence on democratic backsliding is very different, for example, than the influence of the Russian Federation or the influence of American dark money right-wing groups, for example. And so in that kind of environment, the imperative is both a kind of imperative about how do we protect existing democracies against threats from without, but they're also how do we get democracies to collaborate to reduce threats from within and transnational threats. And so any kind of project like this that tries to elevate it to a summit this quickly is going to be muddied, it's going to be confused, and that's a problem. But on the other hand, I think we need to understand what this is about in that context, where kleptocracy is just as much a problem as the expansion of authoritarian great powers, for example, and that they're not even entirely distinct.
Right. So I want to take that point on and expand on that, because you said something important, and it's been said in some other quarters, that there is a issue of democracy not being perfect in many of the countries who claim to be democratic. Indeed, internal issues that are getting potentially worse. And I want to bring in Marlene Laruelle into the discussion and ask her, because she does do some of this work quite a lot, in terms of what about the internal dimension? Is this summit even acknowledging that? I mean, the administration has acknowledged it, of course, but the way the summit is organized, the messaging around it, is it acknowledging that? And second, how would you weigh the internal question versus the external one? Staying for a moment that this norm is important, assuming that for a moment, how would you weigh the two?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that both Anatol and Daniel then after were mentioning, that both the idea of the US having to expand its normative order or being a besieged democratic fortress attacked by liberal forces, both are wrong analytically, and I think they are wrong in terms of their policy impact, but they are the two sides of the same coin. I think, and the reality is much more fluid, right? What we have, what Daniel was describing, is a continuum of what is happening inside our so-called liberal democratic societies and what is happening outside. We have pockets of non-democracy and non-liberalism in the US, and I would really clearly dissociate democracy from liberalism, otherwise we are kind of getting lost. And we have pockets of democracy and liberalism in authoritarian regime. And I think that's exactly that continuum that we want to have really at stake if we want to promote democracy in the world. So this idea of a binary, I think, is a totally outdated software, and it's a dangerous one because it also forces countries to make a choice. And I don't think we want to ask a lot of countries to make a choice, because I'm not sure they would choose us. So I think that's a very risky game, and that was Anatol was saying for in the case of Asia. So I think this outdated software is really missing the continuum of the change that are happening in our own societies. And Daniel was mentioning that briefly. If we look at the last, the VDEM, this big database, which is considered the most rigorous one in looking at democratic progress or erosion, all the contemporary backsliding is caused by democratic erosion in so-called liberal democratic societies. It's the US erosion that is kind of pushing all the data down. It's India, it's Brazil, it's Philippines, it's Poland, all of those who are US partners and who are at the summit. It's Israel, of course, it's Turkey, it's Hungary, the last two are not at the summit. But so if we don't want to realize that democratic and liberalism erosion, the two are being dissociated, are happening in our own societies, I don't really see how the binary mechanism may matter. And just to finish on the point of symbolism, I think symbolics matter, but if we really want to promote democracy, then it's not by taking country as an entity, it's by talking with groups that are either pro-democracy, pro-liberal, or anti-democracy, anti-liberal. In that case, we want to address the grievances of one group and promote the other one. But the way to measure is not a country. So I think it's a complete confusion between strategic partners and values and commitment, and that is really not good for the US policy and globally for the rest of the world.
Yeah, Marlene, you made some excellent points there, and I want to break the rule and stay with you for a follow-up on this. You talked about the differentiating liberalism and democracy. Indeed, they're not the same thing. You can imagine an illiberal democracy, what's called often populism, where you have very popular leaders like Duterte in the Philippines, or Modi in India, or indeed Donald Trump in the US, to an extent, if one can even put him on that list. They have been very popular. They have won elections, which have been fair enough, free certainly, but yet they wouldn't call themselves liberals. They would, in fact, in some cases, like in the case of Hungary, they make very strong arguments against liberalism. They make what they think is a coherent intellectual case very openly and explicitly about it. So how does that really play into the American idea, often when the two are seen as the same? And do you see any sign that this sort of nuanced differentiation is being made in the administration beyond the Summit of Democracies? Do you see that being generally made in U.S. foreign policy? And if not, what should it look like?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's one of the big issues that we have when we are studying what is happening now. And both as scholar, it's difficult to dissociate. So as policymaker, it's even worse, is that we have been so much used to think that democracy and liberalism works together, and that they work with economic liberalism, which I think is also another world that I won't bring there, that doesn't work together. What we have now, we have a genuine revival of conservatism as a thinking, as an activism. This conservative activism is against liberalism, but not necessarily against democracy. And I think that's one of the key elements. We have people who ask for a majoritarian, nation-centric, culturally traditional kind of values agenda, who are not necessarily anti-democracy, but they are anti-liberal. That's one layer. And then we have another layer that I call illiberal, where you have attack on both liberalism and both democratic institutions. But here, you need to bring the nuances of that can be democratic in the sense of having popular support. And I think we should recognize that many of the leaders we see as illiberal have a large democratic popular support, which means that we need to address the demand side and not only criticize the supply side, because the supply side exists because there is a demand. And if we want to promote democracy, then look at the demand, not at the supply side. But what is happening is that when many of these leaders arrive in power, then they contribute to democratic erosion because they want to stay in power. And so they contribute to deconstructing some of the democratic institutions. So it's complicated. They are both democratic in their legitimacy and undemocratic in their practice. But I would dissociate that illiberalism from the genuine conservatism revival that we are seeing, that is part of our, especially here in the US, part of our societies, but which also in Central Eastern Europe is also very grounded in kind of the context and cultural context and history. So really a lot of nuances to bring, but I don't see how we want to hope for democracy promotion without really working on these nuances and bringing them on the table.
Great. I would interrupt this this very interesting discussion just for a second to appeal to the audience to put your questions in the Q&A box. We are going to take up audience questions in a little bit, but then I just want to turn to Anatole again, bring this back to him. First of all, address the points Dan Nexon makes about, he made a number of them actually, but one of the points he made was that this is not a black and white situation. There are many models of liberalism. There are many models of authoritarianism, and he also said that hypocrisy is not such a bad thing. Hypocrisy, if anything, strengthens a norm, because that creates. I think I'm putting words into his mouth now, but. Creates that distinction and allows him to define also the non-hypocritical acts, and thereby makes a case for them, in a way strengthens them or makes them a thing in discourse. So address that, and does that really work for you? And is hypocrisy a productive force in international relations when it comes to democracy, or indeed anything else?
Well, I entirely agree with Dan. I mean, it's certainly an inevitable force in international relations. There is the old saying, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And I think that is an argument. And it may, play a role in, shall we say, embarrassing illiberal leaders. Although I don't regard, I have to say, Narendra Modi as a very embarrassable figure from that point of view. But I suppose what I worry about is, having lived for a brief time in the former Soviet Union and having observed it over the years, that the risk is that the rhetoric of democracy becomes empty and is seen to become empty. That it simply detaches itself so far from the reality of US policy that the entire project is discredited. And at this summit, in fact, US representatives will confine themselves to pious bromides, and Modi and others will simply say what wonderful democracies they have, and that will be the end of it. But something else that worries me, and I, of course, entirely agree with both the other speakers on the this not in fact being binary. But I certainly see, and if you look at rhetoric from both the Democratic and the Republican parties in the United States, and the Trump administration, people like Secretary of State Pompeo, as well as the Biden administration, there definitely is an attempt to cast the world as two camps, with strong echoes of good against evil. And also, of course, this idea that at least some of the problems of democracy in the United States today are overwhelmingly attributable to, well, mostly Russian interference or manipulation. I think that is a distraction from the need, the reality and the need of urgent domestic reform in the United States. But I think as well, it does for me summon up some rather worrying echoes of the Cold War. At home, McCarthyism, the idea that evil foreign powers are infiltrating the United States and manipulating Americans. This is not good for the domestic democratic debate in America, and can really shut down debate on important areas of foreign policy. But the other thing is something that was noted by many leading American historians and commentators, C. Vann Woodward, Richard Hofstadter, during the Vietnam War, that the portrayal of America, the belief in America as leading this great moral crusade in the world, which of course has deep, deep roots in American political culture, but that can be used actually to justify American atrocities and support, for, in some cases, truly evil regimes elsewhere in the world, in Central America, as we know, in parts of Africa. Because, of course, this is justified if the overriding goal in the world of freedom and democracy, and America's leadership of this is not just morally good, but morally essential. There's almost a religious factor here. You can commit terrible crimes for the sake of your religious faith, if you really believe in it. And that is something that I fear America could fall into again, if this idea of America leading a struggle of democratic good against authoritarian evil really takes root. And as I say, in a sense, it's rooted already, because this belief is deeply rooted in American civic nationalism and political culture. As Hofstadter famously said, it has been our fate as a nation not to have an ideology, but to be one.
Right. So very interesting points there. And I want Dan Nexon to respond to that a little bit, but also I want to build on that. This question of having a norm, and many countries have norms. It's not just the US. But having a norm versus looking for blocks, looking for the sort of black and white divide, having a mentality of, for lack of a better word, perhaps a religious or a crusade-like mentality on those states or those entities that don't conform to norms and values. Of course, we saw that flamed during the war on terror with terrible consequences in the Middle East. But are we not in the danger, given that many of the same actors are present currently shaping policy, or at least were in some way, shape or form a part of the establishment? Don't we have the risk today of the same sort of black and white, block-oriented policy outcomes? Yes, the nuances are all understood in the research communities and the academia, but in the policy world, the articulation seems to be quite stark and centered on Russia and China, with no grayness allowed for them, let's say. So isn't there the danger of this sort of black and white, zealous type of foreign policy coming from the summit and beyond?
Well, I don't know if the summit is the biggest. It's sort of interesting here, right? Because on the one hand, we're saying that, I think correctly, that the summit really muddies the waters when it comes to and emphasizes hypocrisy, because the list of invitees does not track at all with any kind of ranking of democracy. And that's true. I think that's a problem with the summit. But I also think that that sort of mitigates or attenuates the risk that we're creating a black and white world, right? Because how can you have a neat set of camps if the in-group is a hodgepodge of different types of regimes that are differentially committed to liberalism and democracy? And I think it comes back to what I would say are kind of two big issues, is that we can focus on the threat to democracy as the quintessential challenge and security challenge to the United States right now. And I would say that's true, understanding the challenge to democracy is very much one that is transnational and subnational, as well as having international components. But what's interesting there is that the danger, I think, is not that we view a really consequential contest or contestation going on right now between various forces of liberalism of various stripes and various forces of illiberalism of various stripes, where the possibility of different kinds of alliances, different types of coalitions are more fluid than we would expect. The danger is actually on the great power conflict side of the equation, right? And the people who claim to be, I think, much more realist, even ultimately, because those are, that is, first of all, the camp that is arguing for a block binary conception of the world, right? One which is where it is state alignment that is the fundamental question, right? Whether you are with the United States or with China or China/Russia, or maybe just China if somehow the US can wedge apart China and Russia, depending on sort of which part of the camp that you're in. And so that's where the binary is. And the danger then becomes that binary becomes artificially overlaid with an understanding of democracy versus authoritarianism. or not even artificially overlaid that you have, for example, in, I think, some of the GPC. If you look at the sort of heart of the GPC rhetoric, there's an idea that the reason why China, Russia, and others are implacable foes of the United States is ideological. Yet at the one hand, much of the advocates of the strong GPC conception are also deeply critical of US liberalism and US liberal hegemony. So it's a weird kind of hodgepodge. So I think that it's, even on this front of kind of what gets you the Manichaean struggle, I think it's actually quite fluid and complicated. And I'm not quite sure how that plays out. I will say that at root, the reason I think we have to be very, very concerned about any understanding of contemporary global order as being a struggle between blocks of states that are aligned with one ideology and another is that the United States has two stories about its great ideological smackdowns, right? The first story is there's a big ideological smackdown between the United States and between liberalism and fascism, and fascism loses in World War II. And the second is that there's a big smackdown between liberalism and communism, and liberalism prevails with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Neither of these are models for how any, I would hope, any future great power rivalry would go. I mean, I don't think, fascism is defeated because of a massive major power war that leaves hundreds of millions dead, which had both sides been nuclear, who knows what would have occurred. I think if Hitler had not been expansionist, we would still have fascist state, fascist states now. It's only the sort of the outcome of a global war and the contingent victory of one side that gets you that victory. And then I don't expect that most states are going to make the kind of series of disastrous policy choices that the Soviet Union did in the last 5 or 6 years of its existence. And so I doubt that that's going to be the outcome. So there is no victory scenario for an ideological struggle. And that's, I think, why we have to be particularly wary. It's not clear what that would even look like. So.
Right. Great. I'm going to try and bring in some audience questions now. We have a question from John McAuliffe, which I think Marlene might be best equipped to answer, although any of you can jump in here. There's a tension, he says, and I can read this question to you. Could you talk about the contradiction between exporting democracy and respect for sovereignty? US democracy funding and fulsome support for opponents of the Cuban system strengthens authoritarian tendencies to protect political independence. It's not just the Cubans that are slow to adopt the Vietnamese model. The US is even more reluctant to adopt the model of respectful bilateral relations. Basically, what he's trying to get at is the fact that the US is quite comfortable talking about the sovereignty norm as not being relevant. We can support NGOs that promote certain views in Ukraine or where else. But when there is influence from outside in US elections, there is an immediate turn to the idea that there's interference from foreign sources, and there's a very sovereignty-centered argument there. So Marlene, you worked on this, on transnational networks of how illiberalism is exported. And indeed, of course, liberalism is exported for a long time through very strong networks. So speak to this question about this gap and what that suggests to you about where we are heading here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think there have been this kind of double standard in interference can be good if it's for exporting the good ideology, but it's bad when it's for exporting the bad ideology. And I think that's one of the weakness of this kind of liberal internationalism that think that it has legal and moral tools to interfere into domestic issues. And I think that's what we see now, with this kind of the narrative on sovereignty coming back on the side of illiberal government. And I think on that, Russia has been really leading in trying to rebrand sovereignty as something that is really key for a nation. And I would see that even more complicated because in the case of the European Union, you have really also kind of sovereignty claims that come against the EU supranational structure. So I think it's a good example of the hypocrisy Anatol was mentioning, where in fact we allocate moral values to an intervention outside. And so in that case, it's black and white. There is the good side of interventionism and then the back side of interventionism. What it is missing in all cases, I think, is that's how much it is important to look at what local actors want. And I think in the case of the so-called foreign intervention on US sovereignty, I think that's a key element, is that foreign actors are only echo chamber of what is happening in our own societies. And I think the way we kind of misinterpreted or created this huge hysteria around Russia's interference in the 2016 election, and now globally, each time we want to bring Russia back in our domestic debates, we are missing the point that it's mostly grassroots transformation happening in our own societies, and that Russia or potentially China just play an echo chamber. So like the same, don't fight the echo chamber, solve the issues at home, and then the echo chamber effect will by itself disappear or be really minimalized.
Right, great. Anatole, I want to turn now to this argument that's been made on the summit. That is, well, the summit has flaws, but historically we had a particular incident that turned out to be very positive for the US and its partners. And that was the 1975 Helsinki Accords, which were then became the foundation of a sort of an international idea of human rights. And indeed, were influential, it is argued, in opening up eventually the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc of communist states. Can the Summit of Democracy serve that function, even if not quite to that level? Is this really a gain from the summit that you would see as relevant, or how would you respond to that argument?
Well, I'm afraid to make that work, you'd have to invite Russia and China to the summit, which would rather defeat the point of the rest of the exercise. But of course, there are so many other factors involved as well. As Dan said, the Soviet Union made so many mistakes. Well, I mean, its economy was one giant mistake towards the end. That is emphatically not true of China today, and only to a limited extent true of Russia. Of course, it's not true of America's allies, which have their problems, but they're not related to the ideological battle between democracy and authoritarianism. This is not what the problems of the Indian economy are about. But also, of course, Helsinki worked once again in Europe, in Eastern Europe, the communist bloc and the Soviet Union. And it worked there because, as I said before, it had the image of the relative overwhelming success of the capitalist democratic systems compared to the crumbling Soviet communist systems. And of course, it also had local nationalism on side, Polish nationalism, Hungarian, Baltic, all of them directed against hegemony from Moscow. None of this applies if what one's thinking about is how to bring the governments of India or Brazil or the Philippines towards, greater, well, as Marlene quite correctly pointed out, you're not trying to bring them towards greater democracy because they're all elected. You're trying to bring them towards greater respect for the rule of law, for free speech, for minority rights, all of these things, which A, is a much more complicated business. And B, of course, in the end, if you look at Hungary and Poland, was not decisively achieved. I mean, it was improved, certainly, obviously, compared to the communist system. But when it comes to these issues, these are still very much live issues in this whole row of American allies.
I want to get Dan Nexon back into the conversation, and I want to ask you, Dan, there's a question actually from Robert P. from the audience, and he wants to know how the factor of economics ties into all of this. So he basically asks how much of the turn away from democracy is rooted in disillusionment with the extent of economic liberalism. Now, I want to build on that point a little bit more. If I look at the world today, the Summit for Democracy and the Biden administration has made a case of a divide of democratic states against authoritarian states as a core divide in the international order. And we have all in this discussion tried to nuance that into some degree or another. But if I stand back and if I'm located in Johannesburg or Nairobi or Jakarta or New Delhi, I look at a different divide. I see a different divide. I see a divide of those who have a lot and those who don't have a lot. So most urgently, we can see that in the COVID pandemic scenario, where in the wealthy world, about 70% of the population is vaccinated. In Africa, only 7%. And this is 18 months after the pandemic and about 9 months after vaccines came online. So isn't this a much more consequential divide that affects the lives of people in stark ways in terms of life and death across hundreds and hundreds of millions, indeed billions of people across the world? And why is there no energy from many in the camp that support this democracy as a norm to say, well, we need to have a norm of global equity as well, and perhaps have a summit around that. We also saw that in the climate change negotiations, where the loss and damage push from the poorest countries in Africa was sort of not quite mothballed, but sort of reversed or not addressed adequately according to them. So speak to that economic issue and this other stark divide. What do you think about that?
A really good question, one which I can't possibly give an adequate answer to. Let me step back for a second and just start with something that will frame my comments, which is that in the book that is behind me with Alex Cooley, we distinguish, and we're not the only people to do this, between three kind of broad baskets of liberalism. Political liberalism, understood as being bundles of rights, rights of citizens against governments, all the way through electoral democracy. Liberal intergovernmentalism, meaning forms of international cooperation that follow kind of liberal flavors like multilateralism, like sovereign equality, et cetera, and then economic liberalism, which at a minimum involves some commitment to free trade, but can come in a lot of different flavors. The most recently dominant one, I don't like the term, but we've taken to call neoliberalism, right? As opposed to, say, maybe embedded liberalism or more social democratic variants or New Deal liberalism. And as a good kind of progressive, who I would like to believe very strongly that the failure of neoliberalism to deliver the goods for a lot of people in the so-called Western democracies is part of the rot of political liberalism, which is something I also care a great deal about. I would like to believe that global equity, that sort of more, I support a lot more US foreign aid. One positive externality of a US-Chinese competition might be more aid flowing, more aid and more trade agreements that are, maybe benefit a broader segment of people flowing into the so-called developing world. I'd like to sort of, that's sort of generally, that's my kind of normative commitment. I'd like that to be true. I do think that neoliberalism is a big part of our current problem. I think a lot of that has to do with the ways in which neoliberalism privileged capital mobility, which has contributed to the globalization of kleptocracy and oligarchic tendencies, which are, I think, fairly important in the story about the erosion of liberalism, both in less consolidated and more consolidated democracies. All of that being the case, I certainly don't think that it is the evidence, the scholarship demonstrates that within backsliding democracies that ultimately this is primarily an economic issue. I think that if we were to artificially distinguish between economic and cultural issues in economic and identity politics, which I don't think are actually clean distinctions, I think we would find that cultural politics, notions of status, which are tied in part to economic considerations, but are also tied to identity, symbolic identities. I think those are driving a lot of the dynamics. Would I like then also to get much greater buy-in to a kind of politically liberal order through the kind of big equity arrangements that Robert suggests, I think yes. But I also think the problem right now, if you think that, as I do, that in a place like the United States, political liberalism is kind of on life support, is that part of the problem that left liberal and progressive forces have right now is being able to articulate a narrative of national identity, which is compelling to people. And you have to be very careful about how you navigate between an internationalist cosmopolitan notion of distributional justice and also a politically viable way of resurrecting a kind of civic nationalism or in a civic civilizational identity and a civic global identity that can accommodate people's needs for more rooted status group membership. And I don't know how to do that. So.
We have an audience question from Michael Swain, and this ties to some of Marlene's work. He speaks of authoritarian states actively working to undermine democratic societies. We touched upon that a little bit earlier, Marlene, but I want to add to that. Michael asks, is this argument credible? Are they indeed trying to undermine democratic societies? You have worked on networks of illiberal service export from Russia and China. So tell us a little bit about this. Are Russia and China, certainly illiberal states run by illiberal leaders, are they trying to export these norms or other sorts of tools to other countries? How does that work? How successful is it currently? Where is it going? Just speak to that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And honestly, I don't think we should see Chinese or Russian foreign policy being driven by ideological impulse of fighting against liberal democracy. I think their foreign policy is much more based on kind of self-preservation, regime security, what they define as their own sovereignty. And inside that large vision of their own foreign policy, you have a room for kind of ideological competition. But that it's only an element. So all the narrative about like US, Russian foreign policy entirely being driven by fighting liberal democracy, I think is a wrong way of looking at what Russia has been doing. And the same works for China. So you have, yes, an ideological component that can be part of the kind of portfolio of foreign policy action, but it's a small one, and it's a one that works because we are ourselves weak and feeling less and less confident about our liberal democratic order. So I think that's here also it's a mirror game. It's because we have homegrown grassroots forces that question liberal democratic order at home, that we have that ideological component that has been integrated into especially the Russian foreign policy portfolio. But the Russian foreign policy portfolio is larger than ideology, and it has ideology because we have it also. And so the project you are mentioning, in fact, yeah, we are working at the way a lot of countries are buying Russian and Chinese products for illiberal governance, and we really look mostly at what is the local demand. So he also giving back agency to states in the way they choose how they want to get knowledge, infrastructure from the West, from Russia, from China. And I think that's also a key element in the debate, that we always try to look at the kind of the great power competition between the three potential models, but we tend to forget what is happening on the ground, what are the local contexts and the reasons for making choices. And when you put this kind of local context into the picture and you look at how states make decisions, then you see a larger room of maneuver. You see much more nuances in the way country makes selection. And sometimes they can buy Russian or Chinese tool for illiberal governance without seeing a shift in the way they are managing themselves, their own society. So I think it's important to kind of give back agencies to all the states that are not the three big power, and to see how much for them the picture is much more nuanced and complicated than we want to see it in terms of this kind of big fight against two ideological principles.
Dan Nixon, Marlene makes a very important point there, and I would also add to that, saying that there is this talk of illiberal export of illiberal ideas, tools, and so forth. But that's hardly only coming from Russia and China, isn't it? And we had, of course, the very famous scandal of Edward Snowden 7 years ago. We recently had a very credible news about export of cyber weapons from Israel, the Pegasus cyber weapon. Israel is a democracy, at least within its internationally legalized borders. So is this really a differentiation that we are talking about, or is this really a case of realpolitik that's practiced by all states, democratic and liberal and illiberal and otherwise?
Well, I think that we have to be careful about drawing too stark a distinction between realpolitik and questions of norms and values. What I would emphasize for that is that, the way that I see it, in the 2000s, the US essentially securitized liberal order and democracy promotion and liberal promotion for regimes like Russia and China, and for a lot of authoritarian regimes, through the combination of the way that the Color revolutions played out, militarized democracy promotion in the Middle East, running all the way up through the various dynamics of the Arab Spring, the intervention in Libya. What the United States helped to do was make the ways in which not only its own liberalization, liberal order promoting policies, but also the very ways in which kind of liberal order, sort of democracy, the very ways in which democracy as a normative good and human rights as a normative good are baked into the constituent elements of things like the United Nations. It made that a security threat for these regimes. And so part of the realpolitik reason to strip peacekeeping mandates of human rights elements, to be active in international organizations, to set up an alternative ecosystem of non-politically liberal multilateral institutions is regime survival. It's to protect regimes against potentially destabilizing forces. Now, yeah, it's 100% true that, one of the things we have to resist is that I don't think we have to engage in false equivalency to recognize that the United States exports a lot of illiberalism, right? Whether, we talk about Russian funding for parties like the Liga and the National Rally, but there's some evidence that US dark money is accounting for a larger percentage, for example, of illiberal nationalist political dollars in Africa and Europe than, say, Russia is. And Israel is another good example. It's, of a country that actually slid also increasingly into a liberalism that engages in the export of technologies under kind of neoliberal principles of, make as much money as possible. And so there's a whole lot of stuff going on here. And to that extent, I think it's exactly right to stop thinking about this primarily in terms of, us versus them, but to think about various regimes, various political movements, and various, businesses that are all engaged in a highly transnationalized environment. And that is what makes actually things so difficult for anybody who wants to try to defend liberalism right now.
Anatole, I want to get to some of what Dan is saying directly or indirectly and have you respond. One of the things that's coming out from what he's saying is that there is a norm somewhere of freedom, and we can in fact argue that there is a history of an a turn towards emancipation through at least much of the 19th and 20th centuries. And nationalism was initially a force for emancipation from empires. And then, of course, we had the anti-colonial movement against the depredations of European colonialism in South Asia, in Southeast Asia and Africa. At the end, of course, South Africa perhaps being one of the last cases. So there's a norm of emancipation that seems to exist everywhere or in most places. And then there is the realpolitik question, the question of this being used as a tool to create blocks and create Cold War-like paradigms. So tell us a little bit about this norm, if you see it, firstly. And secondly, if that norm exists in many quarters, should that be a part of any foreign policy paradigm that the US adopts? And if not through the summit, clearly you don't agree the summit is a good idea, but could it be a norm? Could it be an idea in US foreign policy? Or should it just not exist in any form, really, when the US relates to the international order?
Well, first of all, I'd like to endorse very strongly something that Dan said earlier about a key problem for liberalism today being its inability to find a national message. Because in the 19th century, of course, liberalism and nationalism were very closely linked. And liberalism derived much of its legitimacy from nationalism and its ability actually to push through what were often very unpopular reforms, in the name of strengthening the nation. So that is a key dilemma for liberalism, and something that perhaps liberalism can also learn from its opponents. As to the question of foreign policy, I myself, well, first, wearing my realist hat, the problem is that the US promotion of democracy in countries like China and Russia are not just taken by their regimes as a threat to their very survival, obviously. Now, that is a challenge to a state's national vital interests, to which that state will retaliate, as best it can. It's bound to. But also, the thing is that many people in the populations in these countries also regard this as a threat to destroy the state. And they point obviously to what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, what happened to a lesser extent in Russia in the 1990s, that in fact the whole fabric of the state will be either destroyed or undermined, and with terrible effects on the population. So this risks, and indeed has in these countries, actually undermining the democratic opposition and liberals, because they are tarred by the regimes as American agents aiming to undermine or destroy the state. I myself am a strong believer in the power of America's and the West's example. I believe that it was the success of our democratic and free market, or at least social market, as it said in Germany, examples. They were what undermined and eventually destroyed the Soviet bloc by simply destroying the legitimacy of communist systems. But for that, we need not the attachment of this to US foreign policy, we need successful domestic reform to cope with, all the problems that we've heard about today, which unfortunately, have badly damaged the image of American and to a lesser extent European democracy elsewhere in the world. If we want to spread democracy elsewhere, we have to strengthen democracy at home, in my view.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to throw out a last quick question to all of you, and you can jump in as you see fit. There's this question of a follow-up to the Summit of Democracies that's been proposed, that this is going to be an annual event. So do you see this this idea as having legs in any form? I think I know your answers, but I just want a quick take on whether there should be a summit at all in a very different format, or an event of some kind, or we should just dispense with this whole idea altogether and get back to other ways of governing and doing things in foreign policy. Anatole, starting with you.
I would say dispense with it.
Marlene?
Yes, Sam, I think you will just bring back everything we are discussing on a yearly basis. I don't think that's the right strategy for the US. There are multiple ways to discuss that are not related to this kind of selection of countries summit.
And Dan, would you advocate for any kind of a event or public engagement on this issue next year?
All right. I thought we were talking about whether or not this was a good idea. I just lost your. I mean, no. I don't. Yeah. I don't think we should have things like summits for democracies. I think the U.S. needs to center liberalism, particularly political liberalism, in its foreign policy, but in a disaggregated and ad hoc way. So.
And that will have to be the last word for today. Thank you to all three of you for some excellent comments, and it really made us think about the nuances of this question. Thank you to the audience for your excellent questions. I unfortunately couldn't get to all of them, and hope to see you at the next Quincy Institute event. Thank you all.